I know the sound of a man who means harm. You'd be surprised how many people don't. They hear footsteps and they hear footsteps. They hear a voice and they hear a voice. But there's a thing that happens in a man who means harm, a held quality, a patience that isn't peace, something behind the breath. I can't tell you what it sounds like exactly, only that I know it the way I know a piano that's gone false in its middle register. One key, maybe two. You play a scale and everything rings clean, and then something under your fingers goes wrong, and you don't even need to identify which note. Your hands already know. I heard that quality in Reverend Galt the first Sunday. He came to stand outside Mabel Holt's gate. That was in October of 1876, late in the month, when the cold had started in good, and the ground had a particular sound underfoot, dry grass, brittle as old paper, the topsoil gone hard. I was coming back from the Alderman house. I gave piano lessons on Sundays after church, because Sundays were the only day the Alderman children were not needed in the fields. I gave lessons on Tuesdays and Thursdays too, at the schoolhouse, but Sundays had a different character. The house was warm, Dora Alderman put out coffee, and the children were in clean clothes and more patient than they were any other day of the week. I walked home the same way every Sunday. Down First Street, left on Callaway, past the feed and grain, which was shut and gave off its smell of corn dust and dry wood, across the bridge over Silt Creek, and then up the long, gentle rise of Meridian Road to my house at the top. It was on the bridge that I heard him the first time. Not close. He was standing perhaps 30 yards back on the Callaway side, standing still, not talking to anyone, not the sound of a man waiting for a friend or a wagon, just standing. And then, when I crossed the bridge and started up Meridian, the footsteps came behind me, measured, unhurried, and they stopped when I stopped. I stopped twice, once to shift the bag on my shoulder, once to listen to a dog barking 2 streets over in a way that told me it was cold and tired and wanted inside. Both times the footsteps behind me stopped a beat after I did. I kept walking. I turned up my front path. I heard him pause at the base of the rise and then move away. I didn't think much of it. A man behind you on a road isn't cause for concern. I went inside and built up the fire and ate supper. But he was there the next Sunday. Same place, same distance, same quality of stillness when I paused. On the third Sunday, I didn't go straight home. I walked 2 blocks past my turning, then cut across at Hennessy and came back up to Meridian from the north. Just to see, or not to see, I suppose, but to listen. And what I found out was that he wasn't following me. He was following who I was following, which was Mabel Holt. I should tell you about Mabel. She'd been in Cutter's Fork about 8 months when all this happened. She came in the spring, took the room above the dry goods store that old Martin Fry rented out, and within a month she was giving piano and singing lessons out of the small parlor at the back of the schoolhouse on days I wasn't there. We'd crossed paths at the schoolhouse the first week. She'd left a hymnal open on the piano bench. I'd moved it. She'd come back and found it moved, and we'd had a brief and slightly sharp conversation about where people leave things and whether they ought to expect to find them there when they return. After that, we got along fine. We had, I think, a particular understanding that comes between people who are similarly self-sufficient and similarly disinclined to ask for help. Was a widow. Husband died of a fever 2 years before she came to town. She'd told Martha Crane that, and Martha Crane had told everyone else, as was Martha's purpose on the earth. She was, by the various accounts I'd assembled from different voices over 8 months, not pretty in a soft way but striking, dark-haired, strong-looking, with a particular quality of composure that some people mistook for coldness. I don't think it was coldness. I think it was a woman who'd learned to manage her own face. She walked home from the Alderman house too on Sundays, because she'd taken over the older Alderman girls on the days I had the younger ones. She walked about 10 minutes ahead of me. The sound of her on Callaway Road, steady pace, practical boots, not the mincing step of a woman worried about mud. A particular rhythm, her right foot hit slightly harder than her left, which might have meant she'd hurt that ankle sometime, or it might just have been the slope of the road. I'd noticed it for months without remarking on it, the way you notice anything that's regular and nearby. Reverend Galt followed that sound. Not me, her. I'd heard Galt preach the one time, which was when he came to conduct a service at our church while Reverend Marsh was away seeing to a death in the family. 3 Sundays in October. He was a visitor, brought in through some arrangement I didn't follow. I went the first Sunday. I didn't go back. His voice was striking. Deep, controlled, with a certain rhythmic build that I recognized from having heard a lot of music. He understood crescendo, understood how to let silence do the work before a word, understood the weight of repetition. Whoever had trained him, or whatever he'd trained himself on, the result was a voice that knew how to enter a room and fill it. He spoke on obedience. The scripture passage was about wives, and then he moved, with a certain confidence, to women more generally. And then the word harlot entered his sermon and didn't leave it. He used it with a particular deliberateness, not as an epithet but as a category, something clinical, and the way he used it made you feel that the category was broad enough to include anyone he decided to put in it. After the service, I stood outside and waited for the crowd to clear. Ed Prout came and stood next to me, and we listened to the general sound of the congregation dispersing, boots on the steps, the creak of wagon boards, the particular sound of a town reassembling itself after an hour of being still. "Good voice," I said. "Yes," Ed said. He was quiet a moment. "Reminds me of a man I once heard in Kansas. Man had a good voice too." "What happened with that man?" "Had to leave town," Ed said. He didn't say more and I didn't push. The 4th Sunday, I walked past my turning again and took the long way back. What I learned. Galt stopped at a point about halfway up Meridian Road, in front of the Harper house, which had been empty since old Cooper Harper died in the spring. He stood there. He didn't approach Mabel's building. She had by this time moved from above the dry goods into a small house on the south end of Meridian, set back from the road with a picket gate. He stood and he waited, and after a time, I stood in the shadows at the top of the road and listened. I heard him move. Not away. He went around to the side, down the alley between Mabel's property and the empty lot beside it. I stood and listened until I heard him come back out and walk away toward the center of town. I went home and I sat by the fire and I thought about it. I don't make decisions fast. Some people think blindness creates urgency, that a man who can't see must be always a little desperate, always filling gaps, always compensating. It's the opposite in my experience. You learn to wait. You learn that most information comes if you're patient enough to let it arrive. You act when you know enough. I didn't yet know enough. I was born sighted, lost it at 19, a fever that took 3 days to peak and left me walking out of it into a permanent dark. By 19, I'd already been playing piano for 12 years, which meant the loss of sight changed most things but not the center thing. I had a trade. I had something my hands knew how to do that had nothing to do with my eyes. I think that's the only reason I didn't go under, not anything admirable in my character, just the accident of already having something in my hands when the dark came down. I came to Cutter's Fork because a man named Alderman, older brother of the alderman whose children I was teaching, had written to a music school in Ohio and asked if anyone needed placement in a growing frontier town. I needed placement. I came. That was 1861, 15 years ago. I was 31 and I have been here since. What you learn in 15 years in a small town is the town. Every house by the sound it makes in wind. Every shop by its particular smell and the way the floorboards sound. Every person by their step and their voice, and the specific pauses they make when they're deciding whether to tell you the truth. I know Cutter's Fork the way I know a piece of music I've played 10,000 times, bone deep, with room enough in that knowing to catch it when something goes wrong. Something was going wrong. The fifth Sunday, I walked to the schoolhouse in the afternoon, after lessons, and I sat at the piano and I played for a while and I waited. Mabel came in at about 4 o'clock. I heard the door, heard her steps, heard the particular way she paused when she saw me, a slight hesitation before she walked in properly. "Mr. Cass," she said. "Miss Holt." She set something down, her bag, and moved toward the other end of the room where she kept her music in a cabinet. I kept playing, quiet, nothing in particular. "Did you want to talk about the scheduling?" she said. "I was going to suggest we shift Tuesdays." "No," I said, "that's not what I wanted to talk about." Another pause. "All right." I stopped playing. I put my hands in my lap. "There's a man who's been following you home on Sundays." Silence. "From the Alderman house," I said. "He starts on Callaway. He follows you up Meridian. He stops at the Harper place, and then he goes around to the alley beside your house." Longer silence. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but there was something behind it, a held quality, not surprise. "How long?" "5 Sundays that I know of." "And before that?" "I don't know. I only noticed him in October." She came closer. I heard her sit down one of the chairs along the wall. "Reverend Galt," she said. It wasn't a question. "I thought so." "He was—" She stopped, started again. "He knew my husband in Nebraska before we came to Kansas, which was before I came here." She paused. "He's been moving, town to town. He's been doing that since for some years now." "Since your husband died?" "Yes." I didn't say anything. "He has a particular view," she said, "about women who are widows, about what they owe to the church. He has a particular view." Her voice had gone flat, controlled, and that flatness told me more than if she'd wept. "I came here because I thought I'd moved far enough." "How far have you moved before?" She was quiet for a moment. "Twice," she said, "before this." I sat with that. Twice. She'd picked up twice already and moved, and she'd landed here and he'd found her here too. I thought about the sound of her walking, that slightly heavier right foot, the practical boots, and I thought about what it cost a person to do that. Pack and leave and start over and pack and leave and start over. "All right," I said. "All right what?" "I'm going to walk you home on Sundays." Silence. "I'm not a burden you need to take on," she said, and her voice had an edge, not hostile but firm. A woman who'd been maneuvered before and wasn't going to be maneuvered again. "No," I agreed. "You're not, but he doesn't know that I know about him, and 2 people on a road are harder to approach than 1. I paused. "Also, I've been making this walk for 15 years and I don't need my eyes to do it. If he tries something, I'll hear it before you see it." A very long silence. "That's a strange reason," she said. "It's the true one." She thought about it. "All right," she said finally, "Sunday." It started raining that week. A cold November rain that came in Tuesday and didn't leave until Friday, and Cutter's Fork turned to mud, and everyone stayed indoors as much as they could. I gave lessons at the schoolhouse on Thursday and heard from the Alderman boys that Reverend Galt was still conducting services at our church, while Reverend Marsh dealt with his family business, which had extended to include a second death, a daughter this time. The boys said Galt had taken to visiting homes in the evenings. Pastoral visits, he called them, checking on the congregation. "Has he come to your house?" I asked. "Once," the older boy said. "Mama gave him coffee, and he talked a long time about duty." "What kind of duty?" The boy's voice had a puzzled, slightly unsettled quality. "I'm not sure. He talked a lot. Something about women who go astray and what God requires of the community when they do." I thanked him and we went back to scales, but I played without hearing it properly. My hands were doing their work and my mind was somewhere else, back on Callaway Road, on the quality of Galt's footsteps behind me, on what Ed had said about the man in Kansas. Reminds me of a man I once heard, the careful way Ed said things. After the lesson, I walked home alone and slower than usual, and I went past Mabel's house on Meridian, not stopping, not lingering, just walking past. The house was lit, a lamp in the front window, the smell of wood smoke from her chimney, the sound of a piano, faint, something I didn't recognize, some piece she was working through for herself. She stopped in the middle of it and started a different phrase, and I kept walking. That evening, I went to see Ed Pruitt. Ed kept a small office on the west side of town. He was the nearest thing Cutter's Fork had to a lawyer, though his actual qualification was uncertain and I'd never pushed on it. He was a careful man, a man who thought before he spoke, and he'd been in this part of the country long enough to know things. I told him what I knew. He was quiet for a while. I heard him in the way I heard all people, the particular rhythm of his breathing, the small sounds of a man thinking. "Then I know of Galt," he said, "not personally, but there was a thing that happened in a town called Ridley about 4 years ago." "What thing?" "A woman," Ed said. "Widow. Galt had been at her for about a year, not anything you could put your finger on, not anything the law would touch. But there was a fire, her place, and she wasn't in it. She'd been sleeping at a neighbor's that week, so she came out all right. But the feeling in Ridley was that the fire wasn't an accident. And Galt moved on before anyone could ask him about it directly. I sat with that, and no one. He's very careful," Ed said, "very patient. And he's got scripture on his side, or his version of it, which is enough for a certain kind of town in a certain kind of mood to look the other way." He paused. "He won't do anything rash. That's what makes him dangerous. He'll wait. He's been waiting 5 Sundays already." "Yes," another pause. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I'd like to know where he goes after he leaves the alley." Ed was quiet. "I can find that out," he said. "Give me a few days." The Sunday I first walked Mabel home, it was cold and clear, the mud frozen hard, and the sky had that particular quality of late November where the light goes early and the stars come out sharp and close. I met her at the Alderman gate at 4:30. She was already outside. I heard her pull the gate shut behind her. We walked without much talking. This was fine by me and seemed fine by her. Our steps had a particular sound together, her right foot, my cane, my left, her right. After a few minutes it became its own rhythm and we moved inside it. At the bridge I heard him. Same place, same held stillness. And then when we started up Meridian the footsteps came, the same measured 30 yards behind. "He's there," I said quietly. "I know," she said. She'd already known. I realized that by the quality of her voice. She'd known since Callaway. She was a woman who'd learned to hear him too. We walked, he walked, the gap held. At the Harper house he stopped. We kept going. I heard him stand there while our steps receded, and then, not the alley this time, he stayed in the road. We reached her gate. She pushed it open. "He stopped at the Harper place," I said. "He does that when I'm not alone." A pause. "He's done this before with the neighbor in Kansas. Whoever walked me home, he'd stop. And then when I was alone again," she didn't finish. "Don't be alone again," I said. "On Sundays or evenings." "I can't," she stopped. I heard her steady herself. "I have a life here, Mr. Cass. I have pupils. I have a house. I won't be run off again." "I know," I said. "That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying let me walk you home on Sundays." "You already are." "I'm saying let me keep doing it until this is settled." Another pause. "You said until it's settled. What does settling it look like?" "I'm working on that," I said. She was quiet. Then with the dry edge I'd heard from her before, the slight wryness she allowed herself, "You're very calm about this." "I'm blind," I said. "I've had a lot of practice being calm about things I can't change." A short silence, and then something I hadn't expected. She laughed. Not a large laugh, just a breath of one, but real. "Good night, Mr. Cass." "Good night, Miss Holt." I listened to her go up the path and in through the door and heard the lock turn. Then I stood in the cold for a while on the public side of the gate and I waited. But Galt didn't come up the road. He was already gone. Ed found out that Galt was staying at the boarding house on Fletcher Street, in the good room, the one with the south window and the separate stair. He'd paid for the month. He'd told Mrs. Fern, who kept the house, that he was doing the Lord's work, and intended to stay through the winter if his mission was not concluded before then. His mission, I said. That's what he said, his mission. Ed had also found out this through more careful inquiry, through a letter he'd sent to an associate in Ridley, that there had been 2 fires, not one. The second fire was the one that had gotten Galt run out of the territory. A man who'd stood up for the widow. Hadn't died but lost his barn and 3 horses and his winter stores, and when he'd gone to confront Galt about it, Galt had already left. So he's not just after her, I said. He's after anyone who gets in the way, Ed said. That's what makes it a mission, I suppose. Everyone who stands between him and what he believes he's owed becomes part of the sin he's correcting. I thought about that for a long time, the particular logic of it, a man who believed his own obsession was righteous and therefore believed that opposing it was corruption. There is no reasoning with a structure like that. You can't appeal to someone whose framework transforms all appeals to reason into evidence of the sin. He has to be gone, I said. Not scared, gone. I agree, Ed said, but gone how? I don't know yet. I played piano the way I thought through problems. Not consciously, not sitting there working out the logic while the music played. I mean that the music and the thinking happened in the same place, and the one moved the other without my directing it. I'd play for an hour after a lesson and come out the other side with something clearer. Other people take walks or whittle or stare at a fire. My hands want keys when I'm working through something that won't come clear. That Wednesday evening I played for 2 hours. I was at my own piano in my front room, with the fire going and the windows rattling a little from the wind. It was a particular kind of November wind, not the deep howl of a blizzard coming, but a dry, searching wind that found gaps. The place where the east-facing window didn't quite sit true in its frame. The space under the back door where I'd been meaning to fit a strip of wool for 2 winters now. The lamp made a small sound in it. I played through some Bach, which I did when I needed my hands to do something difficult enough to quiet the rest of me. The well-tempered clavier, all 48 pieces, though I only got through about a third before the thing I was looking for came to the surface. I sat with my hands in my lap, and I thought about Galt. He was careful, patient. He didn't rush. He had his framework and he believed in it, and he was willing to wait because, in his understanding, time was on his side. The longer he waited, the more alone Mabel became, and the more alone she became, the more inevitable his conclusion felt to him. He'd done this before. He'd let a widow and anyone who helped her feel the pressure of him, slow and constant until they broke. He'd burned a barn in Ridley not in rage but as a message, calibrated to isolate, telling the man who stood up, "You'll lose more than a barn if you continue." The man had gotten the message. They usually did. What broke people was not being able to see the thing that threatened them. Galt was careful never to put his threat into words where it could be held against him. He had the preacher's cloak, the scripture, the public face of a man concerned for souls. The threat lived in what he didn't say, in his presence on a road at night, in the patience of it, in the knowledge he communicated without ever communicating it that he would still be there tomorrow, and the day after and the day after that. I understood that better than most. Invisible threat is its own particular instrument, and I'd spent 15 years learning to name things that couldn't be seen. What Mabel had been doing, moving, breaking off, starting over, that gave him time. Every move reset the clock but didn't stop it. Every new town was Mabel arriving alone and him arriving weeks later, and no one in the new town knowing what he was yet. And by the time they might have figured it out, she'd already decided it was easier to leave again than to try to explain it. That was what he'd been building. A woman worn down by motion, isolated by the impossibility of explaining herself, too tired from the running to think about anything except the next place. What she hadn't done, because she couldn't do it alone, was make the threat visible to a community that had the will and the means to do something about it. I was going to do it for her, not because she needed rescuing. She'd been managing this longer than I'd known about it, and she'd managed better than most would have. But because this was the thing she couldn't do alone, and I wasn't alone. 15 years in a town is not solitude. I had ears everywhere, and I knew which ears were worth the sound. The following Sunday, after the alderman lessons, I did something I'd never done before. I asked Dora Alderman if I could trouble her for a cup of coffee and a few minutes of her time. Dora was a solid woman, not prone to gossip in the way Martha Crane was, not vicious about it, just constitutionally inclined to share information. She had a good heart and a practical mind, and people in Cutter's Fork trusted her in the way they trusted the post office. You could rely on her to carry something where it needed to go. I told her about Galt, what he'd been doing on Sundays, what he'd done before in Ridley, what Ed had found. "Lord," she said quietly when I finished. "I'm going to walk her home today," I said. "I'll be walking her home every Sunday, but I need more than that. I need this town to see what he is." She was quiet. I heard her hands around her cup. "You know that Reverend Marsh is still away," she said. "And while he's away, Galt has the pulpit." "I know. And some people are," she chose her words. "He's a good preacher. He's convinced some people he's here for the right reasons." "I know that too," I said, "but you're not convinced." A pause. "No." "Then help me make sure the right people know the right things before next Sunday." She was quiet for a moment. I heard her set her cup down. "What kind of trouble are we going to have?" "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "He burned a man's barn in Ridley when the man stood up for the widow he was after. He moved on before anyone could prove it. I need enough people in this town on the right side that he understands Cutter's Fork isn't Ridley." Dora thought about it for a long time. "All right," she said. The week that followed had a particular quality. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it in the way people moved around me, a town in which certain information was traveling, being weighed, landing differently in different people. At the feed store on Tuesday, Jensen the proprietor said, "Strange man, that visitor preacher," in a way that meant he'd been told something and was thinking about it. He said it the way men say things they want a response to, testing whether the other person knows what they know, and I said, "I've heard the same." And that was enough. Jensen's voice relaxed, just slightly, in the way voices do when a private worry becomes a shared one. Mrs. Price, who usually stopped me on Callaway to chat about her boy's progress at the piano, didn't stop me on Wednesday, but she spoke my name when I passed her, just that, "Mr. Cass," and there was a note in it, something between acknowledgement and alignment. I'd known Mrs. Price 12 years. I knew the sound of her being careful. At the schoolhouse that afternoon I heard, through the open window of the small room where I taught, the sound of two women talking in low voices at the side of the building. I caught Mabel's name and then Galt's name and then one of the voices. I thought it was young Ada Hefner, who had 3 daughters in the school, said something I couldn't make out, but the quality of what followed was agreement, the sound of 2 people who have said what needed to be said and are now deciding. On Thursday, a man named Clay Burgess, who ran the livery and who I knew to be generally disinclined to involve himself in other people's business, fell in step with me for half a block and said, "Heard something about that preacher fella." "Ed Pruitt would know more than I do," I said. "Already talked to Ed," Clay said. "He walked with me for another 20 yards and then turned off without adding anything more, and I took that for what it was." The town was becoming a wall. I had not expected it to go this fast. I'd expected resistance, the habit towns have of not getting involved, of telling themselves that what a man does on his own time and on a public road is his own business. Some towns kept that habit all the way to the fire. But Cutter's fork had a quality I'd noticed over 15 years and not quite named until now, which was that it did not like to be made a fool of. Galt had come in through the church door, had stood at the pulpit, had sat in people's kitchens drinking their coffee and talking about duty. The town had extended the ordinary courtesies, and Galt had understood those courtesies as permission. When people found out what he'd been using those courtesies to cover, it became personal in a way that pure principle never quite does. The town was becoming a wall. Sunday came in bitter cold, the coldest yet, and the air had a particular sharp quality, the kind that carries sound very cleanly, that makes distance deceptive because you can hear things that should be too far. I walked to the alderman house, gave my lessons. The children were restless in the way children are when something is happening in the adult world around them that they can't quite see but can feel. I kept them focused. We played scales and then a simple piece I'd been teaching the youngest, and at 4 o'clock I gathered my bag and went outside. Mabel was already at the gate. We started walking. She didn't speak until we'd crossed the bridge. Then, something's different. How so? The town feels different. Since Tuesday. Does it? A pause. I heard her take that in. What did you do? I had coffee with Dora Alderman. Silence, then quietly. You talked to her about this? Yes. Without asking me. I stopped walking. She stopped too. Yes, I said. I should have told you. I'm telling you now. A pause. He burned a man's barn in Ridley, a man who walked a widow home. I needed this town to be not that town before he decided to test it. Very long silence, the cold around us, a wagon going somewhere on the cross street, the creak of the boards. I'm not helpless, she said. Not angry, something past anger, more controlled and more serious than anger. I've been managing this on my own for 3 years. You've known about it for a month. I know that, I said. And I'm not saying you're helpless. I'm saying I did something without asking and I should have asked. A pause, but I'd do it again. I heard her take a breath and then let it out. He burned a barn, she said. Yes. She started walking again. I fell back into step beside her. The rhythms came back, her right foot, my cane, her left, my left. Ridley, she said after a while. Yes. I was in Ridley, she said, for 3 months before Kansas. She was quiet. I thought it was an accident, the fire. No. She absorbed that. I let her absorb it. The cold moved around us and the stars were very bright above, the kind of winter sky that feels enormous, that makes the ground feel small. All right, she said finally. All right. All right, you did the right thing. A pause and the dry edge again, the wry note I'd come to listen for, even if your methods were high-handed. They were, I agreed. You're not going to apologize for them. No, I said I'd do it again. She made a sound, not quite a laugh this time, something shorter. You're very straightforward, Mr. Cass. I am, I said. I've found it saves time. He was there at Callaway. I heard him before she saw him. The footsteps came about 10 minutes into our walk, same distance, same held quality. But something was different tonight. He was closer. 20 yards, maybe, instead of 30. And the quality of the stillness between his steps was different, not the patient waiting I'd heard before, but something tighter. I said nothing to Mabel about the distance. We walked. At the bridge he crossed it too. We were halfway up Meridian when I realized he wasn't slowing. He's not stopping, Mabel said quietly. No. We kept walking. The footsteps behind us kept coming. Still measured, still controlled, but not slowing, not pulling back. 20 yards, then 15. Miss Holt, I said. Yes. Walk normally, don't look back. I know, she said. And there was something in her voice then that I recognized, the voice of someone who had done this before, who had walked normally and not looked back before, who knew what it cost and did it anyway. Not bravery exactly. Something tougher. something worn smooth by practice. We were 50 yards from her gate when the footsteps stopped. Not because he decided to stop. There was a sound 2 sets of feet more coming from the other direction, from the far end of Meridian. I counted them 3, maybe 4 people coming down the road toward us, and then from the alley to our left, 2 more sets of steps emerging. Ed Pruitt's voice, evening. Not to us, to the space behind us, to Galt. I turned. It was the first time I'd turned toward him in 5 weeks of Sundays. I turned and I stood between him and Mabel and I listened. His footsteps had stopped entirely. I heard him breathe, once, twice. The breathing of a man who is doing arithmetic and not finding the numbers working out the way he expected. I want to tell you what I could hear on that road, on that Sunday, in that cold. From behind me, the faint sound of Mabel standing very still. She'd stopped walking when I stopped, and she was watching, and I could tell from the absolute absence of the fidget or shuffle that she'd been in situations that required stillness before and knew how. From down the street, the measured, careful sound of Ed Pruitt and 2 other men walking in, not running, not hurrying, just walking the way men walk when they have all the time they need. From the alley to the left, the sound of Clay Burgess and someone else, their breath and their boots, the creak of the fence board as one of them shifted weight. From 2 houses up on the right, the sound of a window that had been opened just a crack, someone listening from inside, someone who would witness if witnessing was needed. The whole night was paying attention. Reverend Galt, that was Clay Burgess from the alley, cold night to be out walking. Galt didn't speak immediately. The silence stretched, the kind of silence that's a calculation, a man measuring what he's looking at and deciding what it means. Then his voice came, the deep controlled voice with its careful rhythms. I'm simply enjoying the evening air, friends. The Lord's night is a man's privilege to walk in. It is, Ed said pleasantly. It surely is. I was hoping we might have a word as long as we're all out walking. A pause. I heard the town around that pause, the cold, the stars I couldn't see but knew were there. The particular quality of silence that belonged to this street on this road in this town I'd lived in for 15 years. About what? Galt said, still controlled, still patient. About Ridley, Ed said. The silence that followed was a different quality entirely. Ed talked for a while. Not long. He was precise, Ed. He chose words the way I chose notes, each one placed where it needed to go. He talked about what he'd found out. He talked about the fire. He talked about the pattern, Nebraska, Ridley, Kansas, here. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He spoke as a man who had the weight of a community behind him and didn't need to push on it. I stood there and I listened and I was aware, in a way I don't usually have cause to be, of being big. I am not a particularly big man, but I am not small either, and I have the particular stillness of a man who has learned not to fill his space with nervous movement. I stood in the road between Galt and Mabel's gate, and I was still, and I listened. When Ed finished, Galt was quiet for a long moment. I see, he said finally. I thought you might, Ed said. And you feel that this is that this is the community's concern. We do, Clay said. The brevity of it was eloquent. Just those 2 words, and behind them the weight of the men on both sides of the road, and the weight of what Ed had said, and the weight of 15 years of a town knowing itself, and knowing what it would and wouldn't allow. Another long silence, the calculation happening again, and then the footsteps turned, going back toward the center of town, going away. I listened until I couldn't hear them anymore. Galt was gone by Tuesday. Mrs. Fern at the boarding house found his room cleared and his money on the table and no note, not even a Bible passage, which was the thing I half expected, some parting scripture to announce that he was not finished and they would all answer to a higher authority. Nothing. Just the money and the empty room, and the impression of a man who understood that the calculation had changed and responded accordingly. Ed sent word to the town in Ridley to tell them what had happened and where he'd gone, so they could send word on ahead of him. It took some working out. Ed wrote 3 letters, and I dictated part of one of them, the part about what I'd heard on the Sundays, the distance and the quality of the following, and we sent them out on the Monday stage. It wasn't everything. It wasn't a trial or a jail or a reckoning in the kind of language the law spoke. But it was what was possible, and possible counted, because what had been impossible before, what Mabel had been facing alone for 3 years, was one person against a man who moved between communities before any community could build a case. What we'd given the next place was a head start. Whether they'd use it was their business. At least they'd have it. Mabel and I talked about it on Thursday at the schoolhouse. She'd heard, of course, the town had heard, the way towns hear things. "Where do you think he'll go?" she said. "I don't know," I said. "Ed sent word, that's what we could do." She was quiet for a moment. "It won't stop him forever." "No," I said, "probably not. I didn't tell her it would be fine." That would have been an insult to what she knew, which was more than I did on this particular subject. But you're not alone in this town, and the next town that sends word back, there'll be more behind it. I heard her sit down on the bench beside the piano. "You know what the strangest thing is?" she said. "No." 3 years. I've been managing this alone for 3 years. Moving, finding new places, getting established. And the thing that moved him, she paused, was one blind piano teacher who happened to notice what was behind him on a Sunday walk. "I have good ears," I said. The dry breath of a laugh, and then, "I know," a pause. "I noticed that back in October. I'd left the hymnal on the bench and you'd moved it, and when we argued about it, you knew exactly where everything on that bench was, down to the inch." "A habit," I said. "A useful one." She was quiet a moment. The schoolhouse was warm, the smell of chalk dust and wood smoke, the particular silence of a room that's usually full of children and is temporarily empty. "Thank you, Mr. Cass." "You're welcome, Miss Holt." A pause. Then she said, with a careful quality I hadn't heard from her before, deliberate and slightly careful, "My name is Mabel." I considered that, the offering of it. "Emery," I said. We kept walking home on Sundays. Not because there was anyone following us. Galt was gone, and I believed, on the evidence of what I'd heard in the way he'd left, that he wasn't coming back to this particular town. He was patient, but he wasn't foolish, and he'd seen that the calculation here had changed. We walked because it turned out to be something we did, and neither of us said anything about stopping. The winter went by in that way that winters sometimes go, each week the cold a little different, a new snow replacing the old one, the town quieter and then less quiet as Christmas came and went. I continued giving lessons. She continued giving lessons. We saw each other at the schoolhouse on Tuesdays and Thursdays and walked home together on Sundays. And after a while it became a thing the town knew about and remarked upon in the way towns remark on things, which is to say it became background, expected, a piece of the ordinary order. In February she started leaving the door to the piano room open when I was teaching at the other end of the building, and I started leaving mine open too, and sometimes we could hear each other's students, the halting progress of a scale in her room, the slightly more halting progress of a scale in mine. It was, in its way, a kind of company. In March she asked me whether I'd ever thought about giving a recital. I hadn't, not in years. The town had heard me play at church events and at the school Christmas program, and that was about all. "You play too well to just play at school," she said. "Is that so?" "It is," she said, with the directness she had when she believed what she was saying. "I've been listening through the door for 3 months. You play Bach as if you learned it from someone who was afraid of it, which is how it ought to be played." I sat with that for a moment. "Did you study before you came here?" "Some in Ohio. I was going to teach music. Then I married instead." A brief pause. The teaching came back around eventually. It does, I said. We gave the recital in April. The two of us. She played and sang, and I played, and between us, we filled the schoolhouse fuller than it had been for any occasion except the Christmas program. The room was warm in a way that schoolhouses get warm when they're full of bodies and goodwill, a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. I played first, the Bach that wanted playing, and then a piece of my own that I'd been building for 2 winters and never finished, and had finished, finally, in February, while she was in the next room working through her own repertoire, and I was listening to her without meaning to. The piece had her rhythm in it somewhere. I didn't name that playing it. I just played it. She sang 3 pieces and then played 2, and then we played together. She'd asked me 2 weeks before if I knew a particular song, an old song her mother had taught her, and I'd said I didn't, but if she hummed it I could work out the harmony. We'd spent a Tuesday afternoon on it, her at one end of the keyboard and me at the other, finding where it wanted to go. It had come out better than either of us planned. The audience was very quiet during that last piece. Not the quiet of politeness, but the quiet of attention, of a room in which people have stopped thinking about anything except what they're hearing. I know that quiet. It's the best thing that can happen in a room. Afterward, people stood around and talked the way people do when something has gone well, with that slightly elevated quality to the talk, the voices a little warmer and more various than usual. Someone brought out a bottle and poured glasses that clinked cheerfully, and I heard laughter from 3 separate corners of the room at once, and the alderman children were doing something energetic and slightly out of control in the back of the space, and Dora Alderman was telling them, without great conviction, to stop. She found me by the door when the room had mostly cleared. I heard her particular step coming toward me, right foot still slightly heavier, still that rhythm I'd first noticed on Callaway Road 8 months before. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening." "You played the D minor partita," she said. "That was—" She stopped, started again. "I didn't expect that." "I didn't plan it," I said honestly. "It came out." She was quiet for a moment. I was aware of her close to me, in the way you're aware of someone close when you can't see the warmth of it, the particular displacement of air, the small sounds of a person present and attending. "Emery," she said. It was the second time she'd said my name. The first had been in Offering, in November. This was different, quieter, with a quality I recognized in music when a phrase comes back, but not as repetition, as something it had been building toward the first time. "Mabel," I said. Her hand came and took my arm, not to guide me, not the way people took my arm to steer me around things. Just that. Her hand on my arm, and the two of us standing in the school doorway with the April night behind us, and the smell of the evening, and the sound of the remaining people collecting their coats behind us. I put my hand over hers. We stood like that for a while. Outside, a dog was doing something complicated with the wind. Inside, the last of the crowd moved and murmured and began to clear. The lamp on the wall near the door gave off heat I could feel on the side of my face. There are things I know without seeing. The shape of a room from the way sound moves in it. The mood of a person from the quality of their breathing. The weight of a moment from the way everything around it goes still. Everything around us went still. "Sunday," she said finally. "Sunday," I said. Her hand stayed on my arm, and we stood there in the doorway, the two of us, in the particular warmth of a thing that has been coming for a long time and has finally arrived. I could not see her face. I could feel her hand. I knew, from the sound of her, from the steadiness of her breathing and the way her weight was settled, and the absence of the held quality I'd heard in her voice for months, that she was not afraid. She was not afraid, and she was here. That was enough. That was, in its way, everything. I'm telling you this because people ask sometimes how it went, how all of it went. The way stories end up in a town, in the fabric of it, and people wonder about the pieces. What happened with Galt? What happened with the widow who came from Nebraska? What happened with the blind piano teacher who walked the same road for 15 years and then started walking it with someone? I don't always tell it whole. Usually someone asks the piece they're curious about, and I give them that piece and leave the rest alone. But sometimes, when the evening is long enough and the person asking has the quality of actually wanting to know rather than wanting a story to carry somewhere else, sometimes I tell it straight through, the way I've told it here. I'll tell you what I tell them. I kept walking, she kept walking. On Sundays we take the long way home, not because anyone is following us, but because in the years since that winter, the long way has become the right way, the one that takes the bridge and the rise and ends at the gate where she turns the key and I wait a moment and then follow. The piano at the schoolhouse needs tuning about twice a year and I do it by ear, which is the only way worth doing it. And sometimes when I'm in the middle of it, she'll come in and sit and listen while I work, not because I need an audience, but because she likes to hear it, the sound of the intervals narrowing to true, the key finding its right pitch, the small adjustments that make the difference between a thing that's almost right and a thing that's right. She told me once a few years after we were on the Sunday walk, the spring walk, mud season just finishing and the first green starting in the verges. She told me that she'd known, back in October, that someone was following her home. She'd heard him for weeks before she knew who it was. She'd been watching without appearing to watch, and she'd been trying to think what to do, and she hadn't known yet what to do. And then I noticed, she said, that there was a second set of footsteps behind his. How long did you notice that before you said something? She was quiet a moment. 2 weeks, she said. I stopped walking. 2 weeks, I said. You knew I was following him for 2 weeks, and you didn't. I didn't know what you were doing, she said, with the patience of a woman explaining something to a man who is being slightly ridiculous. You might have just been walking home. On a different route every Sunday. A pause. I didn't know if you noticed anything. I didn't know if you were aware of him. I was waiting to see what you'd do. And what did you decide after 2 weeks? That you were paying attention, she said, that you knew what was there. She walked again, and I fell into step. I decided I could trust the man who was paying attention. I thought about that. The idea that she'd been watching me the whole time I was watching him, that I hadn't been trailing him behind her back so much as moving through a situation that she already understood, that she'd already been measuring, that she'd been deciding about, quietly, without telling me she was deciding. You could have said something, I said. I know, she said. I've thought about that. A pause. I think I needed to know that someone would do it without being asked. That's a different thing than being asked. We walked for a while without talking. A red-winged blackbird was doing something loudly in the ditch to our left, the first one of the year, and I could hear water under the road where the drainage ditch ran, the creek coming back up from the winter. 3 years, I said. Yes. And no one else. There were kind people, she said. In all the places, there are always kind people, but kindness is not the same thing as paying attention. She stopped walking. I stopped too. You were the first person who paid attention to the right thing. I didn't have an answer for that. We stood for a moment on the road with the spring moving around us, and then she started walking again, and I followed, and after a bit she took my arm in the easy way she had by then, not guiding, just there, and we walked the rest of the way like that. At the gate she turned the key and we went in, and the house was warm, and the Sunday settled around us the way Sundays do when they belong to you, quiet and lit and long, with no one behind you on the road. No one at all behind you on the road. Just the gate closing and the lamplight and the sound of her boots on the floor, and the piano in the corner that needed tuning again, and the whole good ordinary evening opening up ahead.